Civilization is a game franchise that has been known for its consistency. Each game has been critically acclaimed, attracted a large fan following, and sold well. Civilization 7 has a solid number of fans and is shaping up to be not a financial disaster for the studio, but many see it as a misstep. This has spread. It's the first time that the general public has really caught on to negative attitudes towards the development of the series. I'm on record as being a hopefully measured but consistent critic of Civilization 7, but its faults are not new. This is not the first time that the makers of the series have messed up. Flawed launches, difficult development cycles, mediocre expansion packs, and failed spin-off games. The franchise has left behind a series of forgiven and forgotten blunders from which the developers have not always learned the right lessons. History does not repeat, but it rhymes, and each of these incidents offers insights and precedent for what went wrong with Civilization 7. Let's have a look. I will once again get more mileage out of this meme, because Civilization 4 and its expansion were released with no major problems or incidents. The only thing that I can fault it for is that a lot of the systems introduced in the expansions are forgettable. Ideas like corporations that had a lot of thematic promise, but failed to live up to their potential. On a completely unrelated note, I would like to talk about Civilization Beyond Earth. This is a tricky one to discuss, because on paper, with the Rising Tide expansion pack, it is a well-made game using tried-and-true systems with some new and interesting ideas. As a result, some explanation is needed for the malaise that enters the minds of Civilization fans when the game is brought up. Part of it is due to expectations. The creators could not release this as a direct sequel to Alpha Centauri. That game belonged to EA, not to Firaxis. But they did position it as a spiritual sequel. Matt Miller said in a Gameranx interview, quote, "We even have a couple of people who worked on that game still on the team and helping us make the game. It's not Alpha Centauri 2, it's not a sequel. There are many homages and nods and winks to Alpha Centauri, and there's a huge creative and spiritual debt we owe to the groundwork the game laid. But this is a whole new idea. The heart of Alpha Centauri lives at Firaxis, though." The issue with a spiritual sequel is that the spirit of the game really hinges on the theming, the mood, the vibe, and the way that the game mechanics reinforce these intangible attributes. This is one area where Civilization Beyond Earth bears no resemblance to Alpha Centauri. The tone of the game is similar on some level, but the mood of Alpha Centauri is very difficult to imitate. It is a profoundly bleak, and at times horrifying experience, but with hints of ecstasy and utopia. They did try to match some of the plot threads, check out the victory conditions, but Beyond Earth is missing the excellent writing, and it's missing the game mechanics that back everything up. You see, Alpha Centauri's core systems are mostly taken from Civilization 2. People don't talk about this a lot, but I would describe the gameplay patterns and ideas of Civilization 2 as nightmarish. The diplomacy that makes the AI permanently hate your guts certainly has something to do with it, but the terror is lurking around every corner. This is a game where your settlement will be miserable at one population, go into revolt, and you assign a specialist to fix it. And then it starves itself out of existence because you had the audacity to place it on a hill. Have you ever heard of the Eternal War? That was Civilization 2. The game actually makes more sense if you take its core systems and put them in dystopian sci-fi. When you read in Alpha Centauri's lore that they are recycling human beings for their nutrients, and people are forced to watch their children get nerve stapled, suddenly the idea of an entire outpost annihilating itself in a suicidal rebellion seems like it makes a lot more sense. Alpha Centauri's mood and story expertly complement the mechanics that the game is built upon. So, what mechanics is Beyond Earth built upon? It's just Civilization 5, at least before the expansion pack. The core mechanics of the game are remarkably similar, and they're just not a very good fit. The one system that works better is archaeology, exploring the alien planet, digging up artifacts, but the focus on trade routes doesn't really click with the alien world. And in Civ 5, a big thing was that culture was used to adopt social policies, which does not fit at all with planetary colonization. This should be a story about survival, and so as the nation's leader, it's a story about practical governance, not about being a paragon of abstract cultural and moral values. There's a lot of talk about how philosophical Alpha Centauri is. Brian famously did grad school in the subject, and that might be true when evaluating the game as a whole, but governing in Alpha Centauri is not praxis. It's not about choosing one internally consistent set of morals and sticking with them. Even the nicer AIs will turn into vindictive war criminals if they deem you to pose an existential threat to the survival of their people. Alpha Centauri does focus on ideology in a thematic sense, but ultimately as the player, ideologies are just different hats that you are trying on. Underneath the hat, all of the faction leaders are not too far from the leaders from Civilization 2. That is to say, absolute sociopaths. On the other hand, Beyond Earth draws from the ideology system of Civilization 5, which is more rigid. Until the Rising Tide expansion pack, which introduced hybrid affinities, you were making progress along a linear path, picking out relatively minor perks. This is another facet of Civ 5 that doesn't fit well. It's about building incremental bonuses. Civ 2 and Alpha Centauri have big, game-changing shifts. You don't build up bonuses along the democracy path. You are a democracy, but can swap to a police state at your discretion. Buildings like the punishment sphere have massive effects. They cut your science in half, but completely remove unhappiness from the city. And this is just a building. Compare that to these little dinky wonders from Beyond Earth. It's ludonarrative dissonance. The mechanics of the game just do not service the story that they are trying to tell. It's telling that two of the game's innovations, tech masteries and influence in diplomacy, were reused in Civilization 7, where they were well received. The next big mistake in the Civilization franchise were the expansion packs for the early games. This is true of Civilization 2. The game was a big hit, and so they capitalized upon it by releasing 3 expansions, none of which actually added anything to the game. Instead, the focus was on scenario packs, many of them fan-made creations. I don't know what was going on here. This was around the time that Sid Meier and Brian Reynolds were leaving Microprose to create Firaxis. I wonder if, for whatever reason, they were not able to modify parts of the code of the original game, because the changes here are very shallow. Even the developer-made scenarios just reskin old buildings and wonders to fit whatever is the theme. And some of these are truly questionable. Check out the Battle of the Sexes scenario for Civ 2. My non-binary friends, I'm not really sure how satirical this is. The male cities are hardware store and action flick, and the women have cities with stereotypical names like Mood Swing, Romance Novel, and The Zoo. Wait, The Zoo? Are we gendering The Zoo now? I'm not going to go into much detail here because I have an entire video essay on the Test of Time expansion / remake of Civilization 2. Check it out if you haven't seen it, but I will share with you some of the highlights. We've got the Triceratops. Oh, they made a typo. They remade all the visuals in the game to be pseudo 3D and it looks terrible. Also, the Midgard scenario, which was so important that they put it in the game's main menu, was impossible to win several times over due to a series of bugs. This trend of weak expansions continued to Civilization 3. The second expansion pack for Civ 3, Conquests, is fantastic, but the first, Play the World, was a disaster. This expansion, again, included new scenarios. Some of the maps were okay, but generally they were not well curated. The Double Your Pleasure and Ancient Mediterranean scenarios were missing the assets needed to properly function. Teturkan is one of the more popular mods here, but it's a massive map, and at this phase, Civilization 3 could not handle that. I remember doing math homework while waiting for the turns to flip. It also hits the city cap 10 hours deep into the game. The expansion pack was named Play the World because it offered online multiplayer. When the base game was released, this was rumored to be something that they would add in a patch, but instead they charged people $56 in today's money for them to not be able to play online, because on launch, the online multiplayer was constantly lagging and desyncing. This was one of the most common criticisms in reviews. The additions to the game were slim and poorly executed. Guerrillas and medieval infantry are very similar to units that were already in the game. The new worker moves are okay, but the new buildings are available very late into the game and don't do very much. Vanilla Civ 3 had a very delicate design when it came to civs. There were 6 traits. Each of the 16 civilizations had 2 of these traits. This meant no overlap except for the Aztecs and Japan, both militaristic and religious, so they were given different starting techs. Japan is actually the only civ in the game that starts with the wheel, so that even leaving aside the unique units, all of the civs managed to be different. Play the World took that delicate balance and threw it out the window. They didn't add any new traits until the Conquest expansion, so in Play the World, all of these civs were clones of an existing civ with a new unique unit. There were actually 3 civs that were militaristic and expansionist. Some of these unique units are good, like the Berserk and the Ansar Warrior. Some of them were awful and didn't fulfill the intended power fantasy, like the Conquistador and the Keshik. The expansion also came with new game modes that only make sense as options for modded multiplayer, which, again, did not work at the time that this game was released. Overall, nearly everything offered by this expansion pack was broken or superfluous. Like Civ 2 Test of Time, this was panned by all the critics who were paying attention. It's interesting that this isn't discussed when we're talking about the legacy of these games. It's clear to me that the reason for this is that the games stand on their own as substantial accomplishments. Civilization 2 is a complete product. Civilization 3, on release, was a complete product, and the Conquest expansion fixed all the things that Play the World gunked up. This was the pattern of each release between Civ 2 and 4. The games maybe had a few imbalanced pieces, but the core systems were complete, and the legacy of the games did not depend on systems that were added or changed in the expansion packs. With Civilization 5, this was just no longer true. When I bought the game on launch, it was sparse and lacking in content. Just not enough things in the tech tree, but it was also lacking systems, and the systems that did exist were not properly balanced. The meta strategy when this game was released was to plant cities very densely and conquer the world by spamming puppet states. Global Happiness was intended to be the system that would punish players for city spam, but it was very difficult to balance properly. For one, when the game was released, there were too many sources of happiness that scaled with the number of cities. And it was too easy to get cities up and running so that they were not a drain on global happiness. This wasn't super satisfying for people who like to play wide either, because you don't get to manage the cities that you've puppeted. So they started to make changes. The notes from the December 2010 patch show a lot of what they were trying to do, and you can see that empire size and happiness were a major focus. They reduced the empire-wide bonus from maritime city-states. This was absolutely broken when the game was released. They increased the penalties for low happiness and the benefits of high happiness. They increased the bonuses associated with national wonders, which are easier to build if you have fewer cities. They reduced the per-city happiness from Forbidden Palace and Meritocracy, and we can see at least one nerf to Liberty, and I believe that these are buffs to Tradition. And if this was successful, if it was just some numbers that needed to be tweaked, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Unfortunately, much like Rome under Gallienus, issues with empire size continued to plague Civilization 5. The Gods and Kings expansion increased minimum city distance from 3 to 4, and with Brave New World, they just went nuclear. They added a 5% increase to technology costs for each additional city that you plant, while simultaneously actually reducing the scaling effect of additional cities on social policy cost. Still, science is king in Civ 5, and the net result was that large or even medium-sized empires were now frustratingly ineffective. So they had this stream of big, under-the-hood changes to essential gameplay systems, and after all was said and done, they didn't quite get the balance right. It's a good game, but this was one of the important issues that inspired a lot of the changes in the community patch project that eventually became Vox Populi. I don't think that they should have left it how it was on launch, but the mistake here is having overhauled a core gameplay system at the start without really testing what the effects would be on an average play session. They removed a lot of the functional systems from Civilization 4, basically rebooted the franchise, and were overconfident in their design of these new systems. The last biggest mistake of the Civilization franchise is one that doesn't directly relate to the quality of the games, and this is a change in the business strategy and the way that the content is delivered. Civilization's relationship with mods and fan-made content has changed. There's more DRM, and it is increasingly reliant on microtransactions to pay for the ballooning dev costs. By my count, Civilization 6 had about 3 times as many pieces of paid DLC than Civilization 5. And part of this relates to broader shifts in the industry that the series is subject to. Civilization is published by 2K, a subsidiary of Take-Two Interactive, the maker of other juggernaut titles like Grand Theft Auto. This is a publicly traded company with a fiduciary duty to their shareholders, and currently, only 22% of their revenue comes from the sale of full games, the rest being from microtransactions, DLC, and in-game advertising. I think this is particularly bad for the Civilization franchise, at least the way that I enjoy it. I don't see Civilization as a live service game. I'm looking for an expansive experience, but one that is tight and well curated, with the replayability coming from the random map, and not from the designers rebuilding the game every 6 months. Even something like Europa Universalis, in my mind, works better with DLC, despite considerable issues therein, because while feature bloat might be an issue, they can just take an underbaked part of the massive world and add custom content and missions to the factions there. With Civ, there is no massive world map to expand. The comparable option is adding new leaders. Anything else at a certain point is just cluttering up the tech tree with superfluous buildings, wonders, and units. They are eventually making the game worse. To quote Leonard Nimoy from Civilization 4, "A designer knows he has achieved perfection not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away." The need for all this DLC is also a pain in the ass for multiplayer. I do understand the endless desire for new variations of something that you love. In the past, this need was filled by mods, but the series' hallmark of being moddable peaked around the time of Civilization 3 and 4. Part of this was not the fault of developers. With higher quality graphics, it's more difficult for modders to create something that matches the quality of the original product. But to some extent, this is something that they're doing intentionally. More things are being hard-coded into the game, and the ability to make mods is increasingly gate-kept behind proprietary software. I made new resources for my Civilization 3 mod using GIMP, a piece of open-source software. If you are an amateur and want to make assets for Civilization 6 or 7, good luck. There is an active modding scene for the newer games, but the nature of what mods entail has changed. It's not as common anymore to see big overhaul mods with custom maps or special scripts for generation with a unique theme or flavor, things like Fall from Heaven or Escape from Zombie Island. Mods are now more often an enhancement for the regular classic game, instead of a completely new experience built within a familiar framework. Many factors are likely responsible for this change, but I would point to greater barriers to entry for modding and the overabundance of official content. I also think that because the gameplay in the newer entries is less of a simulator and more of a puzzle, during the game, players are less interested in the world around them, and as a result, they might find historical scenarios with pre-made maps to be less desirable. So, the franchise has a few serious mistakes, but had never really been punished for them because the games were always popular and good. It's fascinating that with each of these mistakes, we can draw a direct line between them and the disastrous launch of Civilization 7. Like with Beyond Earth, we saw them not really understand the thematic appeal of the series that they were trying to build on, and following the business model of Civilization 6, you see them putting what should have been basic content behind a paywall. With Civ 2 and 3, we saw the Civ team learn that weak expansion packs are okay if people like the game, and Civ 5 took that a step further. They found that they could release a weak initial product that fans would allow them to fix on the fly, which ultimately worked, and it's clearly what they were trying to do with Civilization 7. If I had to pick a single unifying mistake for Civ 7 itself, I would choose the era resets. They tie into the completely forgettable crisis system and the legacy paths system. It's hard to know whether era resets inspired Civ switching or vice versa, but from reading the dev diaries, it seems that they were really focused on the resets as a way to end late-game fatigue. This also ties into their terrible DLC policy. Needing to pick a new Civ every era gave them an excuse to sell 3 times as many Civs as DLC, and they're really only presenting us with 3/5 of the game. It jumps awkwardly from the Antiquity to the Renaissance, and then it just abruptly ends in the mid-20th century. There's one more thing that really stood out to me while I was doing research for this script. Many of the critics who reviewed these games were attentive and identified a lot of important issues, but many of them did not, and I wondered if they had ever used the game modes or features that they were talking up. This held true with Civilization 7. The critical reception was substantially worse than any previous main entry, but it was still largely positive. This is a series that many of us have a lot of attachment to, nostalgic memories, being part of an active fan community, and wasting our days away in pseudo-historical bliss. But despite how consistently the developers make new entries in the series that we love, I think there is some value in being critical. Many of the biggest mistakes in the series have been replicated when they didn't get sufficiently called out. And constructive criticism from fans has led to some of the franchise's greatest triumphs. Despite flaws in the development and rollout of Civilization 3, 5, and 6, all of these turned into incredible final products. Maybe that's the direction that things will move in for Civilization 7. Okay, that's all for today, everybody. I didn't mention 1 unit per tile today. My thoughts on the subject are too nuanced to fit into this video's theme of big mistakes, but I've done a whole video on the subject, explaining why it's the small details and the execution that often make combat tedious when playing Civ, not the ability or inability to stack units. Check that out if you haven't already. But if you have seen that one, that was like a year ago. How are you not subscribed yet? Be sure to fix that mistake. I will see you next time. Cheers.